Lyudmila Pavlichenko was just a fourth-year history student at Kiev University when the rumble of tanks and the wail of sirens changed everything. It was June 1941, and Hitler had just launched Operation Barbarossa, sending 3 million German soldiers pouring into the Soviet Union. For Lyudmila, a 24-year-old woman who had spent her childhood as a tomboy, competing in track and field and sharpening her eye at a local shooting range, there was no hesitation. She grabbed her documents and marched straight to the recruiting office, ready to defend her homeland. She stood in a long line of anxious men, and when she finally reached the front desk, the registrar barely looked up. "Nurses are needed at the field hospital," the man said, stamping papers without even meeting her gaze. Lyudmila stood her ground. She explained that she was a seasoned marksman, that she had earned the Voroshilov Sharpshooter badge and spent years practicing at a sniper school. And the registrar finally looked at her, but his expression was one of amusement rather than respect. He laughed and waved his hand. "Girls can't join the infantry. They certainly can't be snipers. The front lines are no place for a woman." The men behind her in line snickered. Some made crude jokes under their breath. But Lyudmila did not blush, and she did not retreat. She was not angry. She was determined. She knew that the only language these men would understand was proof. She was dismissed from the office that day, but she refused to give up. A few days later, she positioned herself near a hill that was being used for testing. When a group of Romanian collaborators fighting alongside the Germans came into view, Lyudmila borrowed a rifle, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger twice. 2 soldiers dropped. It was not a boastful act, it was a qualification. She took the news of her successful shots back to the recruiting officers. Faced with undeniable evidence of her skill, the recruiters had no choice. The mockery stopped, and the paperwork began. She was officially enlisted into the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division. Lyudmila knew that the real test was only beginning. She was heading into a war zone, not just to fight the enemy, but to prove to every man in her unit that a woman with a rifle was not a liability. She was an asset. The siege of Odessa was a brutal baptism by fire. For 2.5 months, Lyudmila lived in the dirt and rubble of the front lines. She quickly learned that sniping was not about glory. It was about patience, mathematics, and the ability to stay completely still for hours on end. She would crawl out before dawn to find a concealed position, often lying in muddy trenches or hiding among rocks, waiting for a German or Romanian soldier to make a mistake. The conditions were horrifying. Supplies were scarce. The summer heat gave way to cold rain, and the constant rumble of artillery made sleep nearly impossible. But Lyudmila had a gift that transcended her training. She had what the old soldiers called a steady eye and a steady heart. She did not flinch when she pulled the trigger, and she did not celebrate when she watched a target fall. She simply recorded the kill in her logbook and waited for the next one. As the weeks passed, the men in her unit stopped snickering. They started watching her with a mixture of awe and respect. While they were firing blindly at the horizon, Lyudmila was methodically picking off enemy officers and forward observers. Her confirmed kills climbed rapidly, 50, then 100, then 187 by the time the siege ended. The soldiers who had once mocked her began calling her by a nickname that stuck: Lady Death. But the Germans, listening to her through their radio intercepts, gave her another name. They knew a specific sniper was hunting them, a phantom who never missed. They broadcast desperate messages into the Soviet lines, promising her chocolates and a promotion to German officer if she would defect. Lyudmila ignored the bribes. She was not fighting for money or rank. She was fighting for her country, for the friends she had already lost, and for the satisfaction of knowing she was better than the men who had laughed at her. However, the war was not staying still. The Axis forces were too strong, and the Red Army was forced to retreat. Lyudmila and her unit packed their rifles and moved east to the Crimean Peninsula, where an even greater challenge awaited them: the siege of Sevastopol. Sevastopol was a fortress city by the sea, and the fighting there was savage. The German army, frustrated by the stubborn Soviet defense, threw everything they had at the city. Lyudmila found herself in an urban and rocky hellscape, where snipers on both sides played a deadly game of cat and mouse. And it was here that her reputation grew from impressive to legendary. She was no longer just hunting regular soldiers, she was hunting enemy snipers. The German command sent their own sharpshooters into the field, specifically to find and eliminate the woman they called Lady Death. One such duel lasted 3 days. Lyudmila lay motionless in a shell crater, knowing that a German sniper was hidden somewhere in the rocks above her, waiting for her to move. She did not move. She barely breathed. On the 3rd day, the German grew impatient. He shifted his position just slightly, trying to get a better angle. It was the one move too many. Lyudmila saw the glint of his scope, aimed for the small gap between the rocks, and fired. The threat was eliminated. By the time she was finally pulled from the front lines due to wounds, she had added 36 enemy snipers to her tally, and her total confirmed kills had reached an astonishing 309. The Germans, enraged by their inability to stop her, changed their radio messages from bribes to threats. They announced that if they caught her, they would tear her into 309 pieces and scatter them to the wind. Upon hearing this, Lyudmila smiled grimly. She was not afraid of their threats. She was, however, quietly proud that they had bothered to count her record accurately. In June 1942, Lyudmila's war took a sharp turn. Shrapnel from a German mortar round struck her in the face, as a severe wound that finally forced her evacuation by submarine from the ruined city of Sevastopol. The Soviet High Command made a decision. She was too valuable as a symbol to risk dying on the front lines. Once she recovered, they gave her a new mission. She was to travel to the United States and Great Britain as a propaganda envoy. The Red Army was suffering catastrophic losses, and Stalin desperately needed the Western Allies to open a second front in Europe to divide the German forces. But Lyudmila was to be the face of that plea. In late 1942, she arrived in Washington, D.C., becoming the first Soviet citizen ever welcomed to the White House. She met First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and an unlikely deep friendship blossomed between the two women. Eleanor was fascinated by Lyudmila's composure and quiet strength. She invited the young sniper to join her on a tour of America, to speak directly to the American people. The tour was a culture shock, but not for the reasons Lyudmila expected. She was prepared to answer questions about military strategy or the conditions on the Eastern Front. Instead, the American press greeted her with a barrage of questions that had nothing to do with war. They called her the girl sniper in headlines. One reporter noted that her olive green uniform skirt was too long and lacked style. Another asked if she was allowed to wear powder on her nose or lipstick on the front lines. Lyudmila was stunned. While she stood before them, a woman with over 300 confirmed kills, a woman who had been wounded 4 times, and they were worried about her fashion sense. She felt the old familiar sting of mockery, the same feeling she had in that recruiting office back in Kiev. But this time, she was not a nervous recruit. She was a lieutenant in the Red Army, and she had had enough. In a now famous speech in Chicago, she looked out at the crowd, on a sea of Americans who had not yet felt the boot of Nazi occupation on their soil. She ignored the questions about makeup. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The hall erupted in applause. The question was not just a rebuke to the journalists, and it was a direct challenge to the isolationist sentiment that kept America out of the ground war in Europe. She had turned their own superficiality against them, using the brutal reality of her record to shame them into action. The tour continued through Canada and Great Britain, but the highlight of her journey was the deepening bond with Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady saw past the uniform and the kill count. She saw a lonely young woman far from home, carrying the weight of a horrific war on her shoulders. They spent time together away from the cameras, and Eleanor learned about Lyudmila's dreams of being a historian, her life before the war, and the friends she had lost. Years later, in 1957, at the height of the Cold War, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Moscow. The Soviet authorities tried to keep them apart, but the former First Lady was adamant. She insisted on seeing her old friend. They met in Lyudmila's small two-room apartment. For a few precious hours, the two women slipped away from their government attendants, laughing and reminiscing about the summer they had spent together. It was a moment of pure humanity, a connection that transcended the political divide between their nations. After the war, Lyudmila finally finished her degree at Kiev University and became a historian. But the war never truly left her. She suffered from deep depression and what would later be recognized as severe PTSD from the memories of the 309 faces in her scope, the friends she held as they died, the constant terror of the front lines. It all haunted her. She died in 1974 at the age of 58, having suffered a stroke. She was buried with full military honors. The young woman who was told girls can't join had become a hero of the Soviet Union, her face printed on postage stamps, and her story sung by the American folk singer Woody Guthrie. Her life was a testament to the fact that courage has no gender. She did not just fight the Nazis. She fought the prejudice of her own countrymen and the superficiality of a foreign press, and in every battle, she won. Her legacy is not just the 309 kills, but the doors she kicked open for every woman who would later pick up a rifle and stand her ground, proving that the only thing that matters on the front lines is not what you are, but what you can do.